Today's video is sponsored by Skillshare. A redemption arc is one of the most familiar and satisfying story arcs in storytelling. Redemptive arcs seamlessly fit onto traditional storytelling structures. Watching someone atone, change, and ultimately earn forgiveness is an emotional payoff that resonates deeply with the audience. But what happens when that payoff never comes? When redemption is denied, subverted, or outright fails. Anti-redemption arcs, when a character attempts to redeem themselves but fails, or is never given the opportunity, are far rarer, yet just as powerful, narratively speaking, as traditional redemption arcs. And by exploring these failed or subverted redemption arcs, we can gain a deeper understanding of why redemption arcs are so popular, what makes redemption so appealing, why it is effective, and the cost of denying it.
Forgive me. I did not see. I have failed you all.
An anti-redemption arc isn't just the absence of redemption. It's when a character attempts redemption but fails, is denied, or sometimes outright rejects the opportunity to change. But anti-redemption arcs fall outside of the two traditional types of redemption arcs. We have heroic redemption arcs and tragic redemption arcs.
Father?
No. We do it together. Son.
The heroic redemption arc is what I tend to think as being the most popular and the most common type of redemption arc we usually see. In these cases, a character acknowledges their past sins or their past bad history and actively atones, or at least changes or attempts to change their ways, but is then ultimately forgiven. This arc usually gives the audience a feeling of catharsis. The idea that people can change, make amends, and find some sort of peace. It is an inherent part of the history of storytelling. We can look at an example like Prince Zuko in Avatar. Zuko's arc is a rare example of redemption happening in stages. His first attempt at redemption, returning home, fails because he relies on external validation. His true redemption really comes when he acknowledges his wrongs and actively fights against his past actions. One of the most powerful moments in Zuko's redemption is his confrontation with Uncle Iroh. Instead of being met with anger, he is immediately forgiven. This highlights a key truth about redemption. It requires both self-acceptance and external forgiveness. But one really interesting redemption arc, or at least heroic redemption arc, is Ender Wiggin in Ender's Game. But more specifically, in Ender's Game and in Speaker of the Dead. Ender Wiggin's redemption arc is one of the most recognized in science fiction because it is one that spans decades as he seeks atonement for an atrocity he never meant to commit. In Ender's Game, Ender is manipulated into leading humanity's war against the Formics, unknowingly committing genocide when he destroyed their homeworld. The revelation devastates him. Humanity hails him as a hero, but he sees himself as a murderer. Unlike typical redemption arcs, where characters must seek forgiveness for intentional wrongdoing, Ender's redemption is about taking responsibility for a crime committed through this manipulation. Rather than embracing his status as a savior, Ender chooses exile. He dedicates his life to understanding the beings he destroyed, becoming the speaker for the dead, a role which he tells the truth about the deceased without judgment. His ultimate act of atonement comes when he discovers a dormant Formic queen egg. Instead of seeking absolution, he makes his mission to find a new home for the species he destroyed. This moment transforms his redemption from one of guilt to one of restoration. He does not seek to undo the past, but to make amends through his actions. In Speaker for the Dead, Ender continues his journey by applying these lessons to a new alien race, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. His redemption is unique because it is not achieved through self-sacrifice, but through a lifelong pursuit of penance. understanding, and advocacy. Unlike tragic redemption arcs where characters atone with their deaths, Ender's price is a lifetime of guilt, exile, and the quiet burden of making things right. His story sort of challenges the idea that redemption must be dramatic. Sometimes, though, it is found in choosing to do better, even when forgiveness is impossible. But unlike Ender's heroic redemption, there's Kratos in God of War Ragnarok. Ender's heroic redemption arc is typical for heroic redemptions, where Kratos' arc isn't necessarily about undoing the wrongs of the past, but about choosing a different path moving forward. He was once a figure of great destruction, but now he embraces restraint, fatherhood, and wisdom. The contrast between Kratos and Thor in Ragnarok is key. Both are powerful warriors, burdened by their past. But while Kratos chooses redemption, Thor remains trapped in this cycle of violence.
The cycle ends here. Must be better than this.
Kratos is a brutal warrior who is finally seeking a new path, one that strays from bloodshed and is instead wrapped around fatherhood.
I've partnered with Skillshare in the past and have spoken a lot about the different subjects and classes I've taken. From painting and artwork to productivity and creative design, Skillshare has been a huge asset in my professional and creative pursuits. Recently, I've been taking MKBHD's YouTube success classes, which focus on video scripting, shooting, and editing. Most of you know this, but I did not go to school for filmmaking, nor have I ever really studied the video creation process, traditionally speaking. Platforms like Skillshare are great for those who want to professionalize or even level up on a specific skill or craft. It's an amazing platform for beginners and experienced practitioners alike. Skillshare is the largest online community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. Skillshare can help you take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. It's a platform built by creatives for creatives. Whatever your interest is, Skillshare likely has a class on it. There are a ton of topics you can join, from graphic art and painting to productivity and creative writing. I've been wanting to improve as a creative in the visual space, and MKBHD's classes have been perfect, especially as it relates to creating video content on YouTube. If you want to help my channel out and improve on a creative skill you've been working on, consider coming over and practicing your creativity on Skillshare. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. Thank you again to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video.
Please don't go. It's great having you here.
On the other hand, though, we have the tragic redemption arcs. These arcs are typically bittersweet in some way. Characters attempt to redeem themselves, but at a great cost, and sometimes even their own life. We see a lot of sacrifice or self-sacrifice at the expense of redemption. These stories often explore whether redemption is worth it or if the price is too high, and to what extent we can even seek redemption, if it is possible. But one of my favorite examples of redemption is with Harry Dubois in Disco Elysium. Harry is one of the best examinations of a tragic redemption arc. His story and background are directly tied to this tragedy of redemption and the ability to move on and heal. His redemption isn't just about solving a murder. It's about reclaiming his own identity. The player, as Harry, must actively work to repair his relationships, accept responsibility for his past, and reject these self-destructive tendencies. An interesting and tragic aspect of his arc is that it's player-driven. If you refuse redemption, continuing down the path of, say, a superstar cop, a hobo cop, or the apocalypse cop, Harry will still solve the murder, but will remain self-destructive and in some ways unredeemed. And even if you do push Harry down this path of redemption, Harry struggles with addiction and is crippled by amnesia. Either this amnesia was induced by his own depression, a broken heart, or the ungodly amount of drugs he took, making his redemption arc feel almost impossible at first. Yet even small victories, like staying sober for a day, and the other half of the cop types, like the sorry cop, the boring cop, or the honorable cop. And even more so when we look at the changing perception of the other characters, like Kim, Titus, and even Kuno. They become and feel like these major milestones. This reflects real life in some ways. Redemption is a slow process. It's a difficult process, rather than just being this single heroic act that undoes all of the wrongs that were once committed. Now, depending on how you view this game and its story, Harry's arc can either be seen as this heroic redemption arc or a very tragic one. I tend to think that this falls more in line with the tragic redemption arc because Harry still carries a lot of the baggage and is still plagued by addiction and mental illness, despite having solved the murder and changed or at least redeemed some aspects of his life. In many regards, the game tells you that even if you made these changes, the damage is done. Harry is still heartbroken. He's still an alcoholic. He's still depressed, and you've left a wake of destruction. But even looking at Harry's arc as a whole, and perhaps the small impact that you've had on his life in the short amount of days, the perception might be that this redemption has had an effect that is as wide as a puddle, but goes as deep as the ocean. However, we can also look at Star Wars, where character arcs and archetypes are very common. Darth Vader is probably one of the best and most popular looks at the tragic redemption arc. Vader's redemption is one of the most famous examples of redemption through sacrifice. But what makes it unique is that it only happens because of Luke's unwavering belief in him. His arc suggests that redemption isn't just about personal change. It often requires someone else to believe that that change is possible. His final act, killing the Emperor, proves his redemption, but he dies before he can fully live in that redemption. This is a classic example of the tragic redemption formula. Redemption is earned, but at the cost of the character's life. Walter White in Breaking Bad is another example of a tragic redemption arc. What might be seen as the redemptive moment is one that is sometimes up for debate. His final act, saving Jesse, looks redemptive, but I think that it doesn't really atone for everything that he's done. In his final conversation with Skylar, though, Walter finally admits that his empire wasn't about protecting his family. It was about his own ego instead. This moment of honesty is arguably his real redemption. Not necessarily saving Jesse, but owning up to the lies for the first time. And this doesn't really change how other characters see, or they don't even really forgive Walter, even though he's owned up to this deep flaw. And that is really the tragic part about his sort of redemptive arc in the final season. But probably one of the most tragic and redemptive moments is one that comes from both the book and the movie in the Lord of the Ring franchise. Boromir. Initially, Boromir is noble but flawed. His desperation to save Gondor leaves him to succumb to the ring's temptation. He attempts to take the ring from Frodo in the process. This moment of weakness nearly shatters the Fellowship and highlights the weakness of men and the temptation of this great power. When the Uruk-hai attack, and in the books it was goblins, I believe, Boromir fiercely defends Merry and Pippin. He fights alone, refusing to fall even after being struck by multiple arrows. His stand is not just an act of valor, it is atonement. He does not seek forgiveness with words, but through his actions, his blood. His final moments with Aragorn cement his redemption. His dying words, "I would have followed you, my brother, my captain, my king," are a heartbreaking acknowledgement of both his failure and his unwavering loyalty. It is a moment of clarity, but also of tragedy. He realizes too late that Aragon is the true leader Gondor needs, and that his own desire for power blinded him. He dies with honor, yet with the sorrow of knowing he will never see his home saved. In Tolkien's books, Boromir's sacrifice resonates even further. Frodo, despite having fought with Boromir on who should carry the ring, and that it is his own responsibility, still mourned him. And when Faramir asked Frodo point blank, "Then you would grieve to learn that he is dead?" And Frodo responded, "I would grieve indeed." It adds another redemptive layer. Even in death, Boromir is forgiven by the person who he probably hurt the most. Both of these, heroic and tragic, work because they are emotionally satisfying. They show growth, consequence, and closure. They tend to neatly tie the narrative up, making what we have just watched, read, or played feel like it mattered. Feel like that struggle was worth it. The characters and the plot that we had invested our time and our emotional energy into has some sort of payoff.
I pray, but I'm lost. Or am I just praying to nothing?
But that's what makes the anti-redemption arcs so interesting. They almost act like this path to nowhere, adding commentary on how we view redemption and even take tragic redemption arcs a step further, stating that some people, some acts just can't be redeemed or are incapable of being redeemed. An anti-redemption arc is when a character fails to be redeemed, is denied redemption, or refuses to change despite being given the opportunity. These arcs challenge our expectations, subverting what we want from redemption by showing us its absence. We can look at the Lord of the Rings again. Gollum is a unique case because he could have been redeemed. Unlike Boromir, he has multiple chances to change, but he chooses selfishness every time. Whether that is a reflection of the corrupting power of the ring, or it is a look at rejecting redemption. That is more for the audience to interpret and decide. However, Frodo, like Luke with Vader, believes Gollum's potential for redemption. But unlike Vader, Gollum actively rejects it.
Well, I saved us. It wasn't me.
His final act is a literal downfall, proving that some characters are beyond saving. Gollum is a character who could have been saved, but his greed and obsession prevented him from ever truly changing. And again, revisiting Star Wars, but this time going into the Knights of the Old Republic, we have Darth Malak. Malak's regret at the end of the Knights of the Old Republic is compelling because it's too little too late. Depending on the path the player chooses, they can show mercy or reject him outright, reinforcing the theme that redemption must be earned, not just requested. And if the player chooses the dark side option, Malak's death becomes just another power move, completely erasing any hope of redemption. The end of the Knights of the Republic shows regret from the main villain at the end, but depending on the player's choice, he can be met with cruelty, indifference, or a redemptive hand. There's also Rin in the Poppy War trilogy. Rin's arc is especially tragic because she believes she's on the right path. Unlike Zuko, who ultimately listens to the others around him, Rin doubles down on her mistakes. Her ending is haunting because it shows the weight of all of her choices. Unlike traditional redemptive sacrifices, Boromir or Vader, Rin's death is not a moment of peace. It's the culmination of her refusal to change. The story follows her, a character who spirals deeper into war and destruction, rejecting any possibility of a peaceful redemption. And then there's also Griffith in Berserk. This is one of my favorite, or maybe least favorite, examples of an anti-redemption arc. Griffith begins as a seemingly noble character, making his eventual betrayal all the more devastating. His arc is a perfect example of redemption denied, but not because he was ever offered it, but because he completely abandons any interest in it. The eclipse scene is what cements Griffith as an anti-redemption character. His betrayal is so complete that any sympathy for him is shattered, making him one of the most chilling examples of a failed redemption. This is perhaps one of the best looks at an anti-redemption arc. Any sympathy we once had for him is crushed by his ultimate betrayal and descent into monstrosity. And sometimes these anti-redemption arcs can be a way to reveal the true villain or antagonist's backstory, being the sort of villain origin story of what shaped them to who they are. But these anti-redemption arcs work because they deny the emotional satisfaction of redemption. They leave the audience unsettled and sometimes feeling betrayed. They remind us that not everybody is capable of redemption or worthy of being redeemed. And this really speaks to the dilemma that occurs between expectations and denial. Humans are wired to recognize and see patterns, especially when it comes to storytelling and seeking narrative closure. We often expect arcs to end in certain ways or pan out in others. So when redemption is teased and then snatched away, it can create this emotional whiplash. This is why characters like Griffith and Rin and even Gollum can feel so haunting. Their failure isn't just a simple plot twist. It's a direct rebuke of our desire to see a positive resolution for those characters.
I've never been with any woman but Cersei. So in my own way, I have more honor than poor old dead Ned.
But why do we crave redemption? And why does it sometimes feel like we've been robbed of redemption in these anti-redemption stories or anti-redemption arcs? The reason failed redemption arcs are so powerful is because we as the audience want redemption to be possible. We want to believe that people and characters can change, that atonement means something, and that even the worst people can possibly get better. We want to see the good in people. It is one of the strange parts of the human condition that there's some redeeming glimmer of humanity. There's an expectation that we have when we approach a story and see a character trying to change. We want to see that redeeming moment, either heroic or tragic. But when it's denied, it can leave us with some sort of unresolved tension and sometimes a deeper sense of injustice than their own actions, which can be incredibly powerful if done correctly. And I emphasize if done correctly because this narrative choice is incredibly risky and can be hard to pull off, which I think is really why we don't see anti-redemption arcs occur more often. I think that it can be summed up that it can be incredibly frustrating to invest so much time into a character only to have them remain unredeemed. Because we are familiar with some narrative patterns, an anti-redemption arc could feel like it is coming from nowhere or that it's only there for some kind of edgy shock value. And I do get that argument. I do understand sometimes the dismissal of this sort of character arc. But I think there are some signs and patterns that we can apply to make an anti-redemption arc feel impactful, but also these patterns and even guidelines to go by can help make heroic and tragic redemption arcs more powerful as well. A big rule of writing is that we should really try to foreshadow. And specifically for redemption, if a character's failure to redeem themselves has been built up throughout the story and it feels natural rather than cheap, it can often feel earned. The example here is Griffith in Berserk. But also when the anti-redemption or the redemption, when it aligns with the theme, it can also feel earned as well. If the story is about power, corruption, or fate, an anti-redemption arc can reinforce those ideas, similar to the way in which the themes are reinforced with Rin in the Poppy War trilogy. But I think that one of the other ones, and probably this is one of the trickier ways to do it, is when it challenges the audience's expectations. If the story makes us think a character, but more specifically a secondary character or even the antagonist, is on a redemptive path only to have it ripped away, it can raise the tension for their final scene and even future scenes. The example here being Gollum's final act in Lord of the Rings. But I think in seeing Boromir's death, we also understand that these stakes have been raised and the expectations are now broken. One of the main and most popular characters has been killed off. And again, I want to emphasize that anti-redemption arcs are a risk that we can take as writers. And there are some signs that an anti-redemption arc is set to fail. One way that it can be set to fail is if the story builds to redemption, then denies it abruptly or even arbitrarily. If every sign points to redemption, but it's withheld for no real reason or for cheap tension, it feels frustrating and unearned. Another way is if the audience isn't really given any closure. Anti-redemption arcs don't mean unnecessarily ambiguous or a lack of closure. A lack of redemption is fine, but the audience still needs to feel some kind of resolution. Stories and narrative arcs need some kind of finality to them. And finally, if the anti-redemption arc or the concept of redemption being taken away undercuts the themes of the story. If a narrative is about hope and forgiveness and we use an anti-redemption arc, it might feel jarring and extremely out of place.
You really dropped the ball, Harry. 4.6 billion people, and you failed every single one of them.
But this kind of begs the question, what is the cost of redemption? A redemption feeling unearned hits at the heart of redemption in storytelling. All of us are primed or are capable to forgive or even change our opinion of a character, which is a really powerful thing to understand as a writer. But this becomes the difficulty in the anti-redemption arc, because it is why tragic redemptions work so well. The pain we feel when we forgive someone or see that a character has changed but realizes it is too late, or that this is their final act and it's worthless if no one in the story forgives them. It is heartbreaking. It is powerful.
And the big thing to recognize when it comes to the cost of redemption is that it will vary depending on the character, the story, and the themes. But in every case, there is a sacrifice that is made. Sometimes physical, sometimes emotional, and sometimes existential. True redemption is rarely easy. The greater the sin or failure, the greater the price. Sometimes a character pays for that redemption with their life. It seems that the only option in redeeming themselves is by giving up their own life, either as an act of atonement or because their sin is too great to allow them to continue living. Other times, the character must give up their identity and become someone else. Some characters redeem themselves by shedding their past selves, fundamentally changing who they are or abandoning what they once stood for. And there are also cases where a relationship is sacrificed or a loved one is lost. Redemption can come at the cost of losing trust, love, or the people who once mattered most. Characters can't always have both redemption and happiness. One must sometimes be sacrificed for the other. But relationships aren't always the most important thing to a character. Power is another thing that is sometimes given up. For some, redemption means abandoning ambition, status, or even their greatest strength in favor of doing the right thing. If a character's power is tied to their sin, giving it up often is a necessary step towards redemption. And finally, there's also the freedom and living with that guilt for the rest of their life. Not all redemption is paid in blood. Sometimes the price is living with the weight of those actions. Some characters aren't necessarily allowed a clean slate. Instead, the redemption lies in accepting their sins and moving forward despite them.
Redemption, when earned, is one of the most satisfying resolutions in storytelling. But when it is twisted or subverted or outright denied, it reminds us of an even harsher truth. That redemption is not a guarantee, that there is a cost to redemption. And some will seek it and fail. Some will ask for it and be denied. and some will never even try.